Deena, you know our daughter's in her first year of rabbinical school at Ziegler.
She gets me in her 5th year, so she
Isn't
sticks
that
it out,
fantastic?
and she doesn't get creamed by that.
The apple doesn't fall far
I also
from the
have,
tree.
yeah, these 2 things I have to announce. I have lots of things to announce. Wow.
45 minutes is what you
As
told
much
me?
as you'd like. Listen, this is your night. It's a nice, warm, loving crowd.
I feel
chose
that.
just the intelligent people from the shul to invite. I didn't invite any of the idiots. So you have just the most intelligent people here, okay? And we had to move because the other room's under construction. This room.
You know what else? He never came to get you set up.
Not see that.
Well, we have the mics
not
here.
wired.
We have the mics.
Yeah, but he's got to
Okay, go turn them on. Deena, which mic would be more comfortable for you? You can wear this one or hold that one, whichever one you prefer, because the whole world gets to listen to you, and people from thousands of. Okay, sure. Whatever you're comfortable. You just have to clip it so they can hear it. This is my Shabbos mic, so I wear this on Shabbos.
So you recommend it?
Yeah, whatever you prefer. Great. So I looked up your thing. I looked up your CV online.
Yes.
You're at GTU, and
That's right.
I've always had you come teach Rambam because you did that once for us. But your doctorate's in other things. You just wrote this article about mothers in the Bible.
I'm writing a
That's
little
so
bit more
cool.
about child rearing in Jewish culture.
So
and
maybe we should have you come do that.
I'm,
Why didn't you tell me that?
I'm very excited about that, but I don't know if it's a great debate.
Who did you did your doctorate with Yerushalmi?
I did,
You did,
actually.
really?
Although
One
my
of his
last
last
few
doctors.
years when I was writing my dissertation, I actually worked with somebody named Wim Smit. He's an early modernist, not a Jewish historian. I needed a little more hand-holding.
Yeah, yeah.
I wasn't one of these people who could just produce beautiful writing, and
Yeah.
I think Yerushalmi was better suited for people who were already
Yeah.
exquisite writers.
I never studied with these guys, but I was across the street. So Yerushalmi, Ruderman.
Yes, yes.
What's his name? Morgan Besser. The guys at Columbia who were really interesting teachers.
Yes.
We would hear them lecture. We'd either go to Columbia or they'd come to JTS. And we'd hear them lecture.
Yes.
And it was just marvelous. And my guy there was a guy at Teachers College named Phil Phoenix, who was my teacher. Phil was one of these Renaissance men. He had his bachelor's degree was at Princeton with Einstein. And his master's degree was at Columbia with Nagel. And his
Oh my
PhD
God.
was, he went to Harvard Divinity School with Tillich.
Right, so you're.
I just pinned that on.
We're all ready to go.
All right, is yours pinned on?
Not yet, I'm gonna hold this one.
Oh,
He
okay.
allowed me to
It's just
choose.
turned on. It's turned on.
We
And
should
you're-
pass out the pass outs.
Should I?
Oh, where are the handouts?
They're right
Well,
over here.
the only thing is,
What's wrong?
they're not great. I feel like people are going to look at them and just get frustrated.
You wanna hold on to them and just talk?
Rico, can you hear?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the recording?
No, there's not a speaker here. Just keep talking.
Okay, I'll just keep talking.
Yeah,
The
we'll be
handouts,
good.
I think, are intimidating, so I kind
No, we're usually in the other room, and
Want
so
to
it's.
hand these out or not?
Yeah, hand them out. We'll just
All right,
tell people
sure.
don't look at them. You know?
fine. The font's too small. It's,
All right, so
Lon, is this the right mic?
what? Oh, you have to. Did you open it?
Turn it on, yeah. Is this the right mic?
It's not gonna. You're not gonna hear it.
I know. Usually don't use this mic.
It's only for the live stream.
the great debate before this one was something about Christianity and
Yeah,
Judaism.
what we did was I'll just go
Okay,
down, but we did
okay.
one on the phone.
That's fantastic. Did I see Hillel and Shammai with Gail? Okay. Okay. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, is it a good one or not? Then I'll. No, I'm just kidding. I was kidding. I don't play these.
We did Menelaus and Mattathias,
Wow.
and we did.
I bet it's his. Don't you think it might be his, the young man? That's the one that someone just mentioned to me. Do you think it might belong to the man who was helping with the mics, since he was running in and out? Yeah,
I don't know that this really.
because they haven't been played yet, and people
Oh,
buy
they
them.
haven't? Are these? Is that what these are?
Yeah,
Oh, that's it.
yeah.
Okay, so nobody lost the scratcher. No one lost the scratcher. Okay.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. We're gonna close the door and jack up the heat. So in a few minutes, there's gonna be a steam bath in here, because in Valley Shalom, our heaters only have two settings, right? Steam bath and meat locker. Choose which one you like. And you can take off all your clothes and just schwitz till the end of the hour. We're so delighted you're here. Welcome back to the second semester of Valley Shalom College of Jewish Studies, where you were allowed to take university-level learning without football teams, sororities, and quizzes. Tonight, we're going to welcome Professor Aranoff from GTU, but I want to welcome everybody back. It's glad to see you. I'm glad to see all of you back. We haven't been together for a while. A couple of previews of coming attractions as people are finding their way into the room. The reason we're in here tonight is because the Sher Lapati Chapel, where we usually meet, as you can see, is under construction. And it's going to be quite beautiful, but it won't be quite beautiful till next week. And the only other room in the building right now that has working Wi-Fi is this room, and we wanted to make sure that all of our friends across the world and across the sea could see Professor Aranoff's talk. So we're on Wi-Fi now, and thousands of Jews are tuning in their pajamas in all time zones and across the world to watch. It's actually very true, by the way. I get emails from people who say, "Oh, I live in God knows where, and I'm watching you in my Gotkas," you know. So, like, oh, yeah, one of these days we're all going to show up on our Gotkas and let them watch us. But that would be
It's Kenya.
yeah, Kenya,
For your
Pakistan,
tourist
Tel Aviv, Greenland, God knows where. Anyway, welcome. We're really glad you're here. Look, I hope you had a lovely New Year's, and I hope you're rooting for the good teams in the NFL. But here's what's happening tonight, as we're learning tonight. On Friday night, starting this weekend, we're welcoming a wonderful guest to the congregation. Rabbi Jonathan Slater is one of the directors of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. He's a wonderful teacher of Jewish spirituality, Jewish meditation, and most of all, he's a specialist in Hasidic texts. And he'll be with us. If you'd like to come Friday night, there's a dinner. If you call the shul in a panic tomorrow morning, they'll try to squeeze you in. But even if you don't come for dinner, he'll be doing a very special service and a talk Friday night. Shabbos morning, he'll be with us for the Torah study. He'll be reading a special meditation service. And then following lunch, he'll be giving another talk. Johnny's a wonderful, wonderful teacher of Hasidic texts. And it's a great opportunity to learn with such a wonderful teacher. And then the whole week, the next week is quite remarkable. The whole week is called Mitzvah Week. And there's going to be projects the whole week. You'll see them online. There's flyers for them. All the different things that we can be doing together to change the face of our neighborhood. But I want to bring to your attention, most of all, that on Wednesday night, we won't be having college. We're going to take another week off. But Wednesday night, we'll be having a panel discussion led by Rabbi Farkas on the issue of homelessness here in LA. As all of us know, every corner, every bridge, every off-ramp and on-ramp is just covered now with homeless people, homeless families. It's quite an epidemic. And our guest that night is going to be the LA Times columnist Steve Lopez, who's a wonderful writer. And he was the subject of that film about the fellow who's playing the violin. Yeah. So Steve is coming. We got him to come, and it was a wonderful opportunity to hear from a very important voice in Los Angeles. Plus, we'll be having the leaders of the county and city homelessness task forces tell us what they're doing and what the problem is and how we can all have a part in solving it. So please come next Wednesday night. I think that's at 7 o'clock, but I might be wrong. It's here. In any case, come and join us for that. Next Friday night, not this Friday night, next Friday night's Johnny Slater. Next Friday night, Cantor Fox is welcoming, as part of his series on great cantors of the world, he's welcoming wonderful cantor Jackie Mendelson from New York City, and his son. His son is Danny Mendelson, who's apparently a big comedian in his day job, and at night he's a chazan, or the other way around. I'm not sure. But Jackie's a wonderful cantor and a tremendous voice, but also a tremendous teacher of cantorial music and the history of cantorial music. So Friday night, they're going to do a farbrengen, which means we'll do a very quick service at about 8 o'clock. And then about 8:30, we'll put away the prayer books, close the ark, and they're going to give us a concert and a program together, which is just a great joy. It's a great joy. It's on. I'm talking. All right. So we, thank you. So Friday night, and then Shabbos, they're going to daven with us on Shabbos morning, next Shabbos. And then we'll have Torah study like usual. And then Shabbos, they'll daven. And then after lunch, we're going to have another conversation with Cantor Mendelssohn's, or the Cantors Mendelssohn. And that'll be a lovely opportunity. And then on Monday night, the 27th, we just got this, UCLA's Israel Studies Department has a new director. It's Professor Dov Waxman. And he's here along with a special guest, Jody Ridorin, who was formerly the New York Times correspondent in Israel, in Jerusalem. And we're going to get to talk to Jody about how journalists cover Israel and cover the Israeli-Palestine conflict. A lot of people have been very critical of the New York Times on this particular issue. So it's a chance to talk to the person who actually wrote the articles. Plus, she is now the new editor of the Forward, which is the English language Forward. And she'll be here to talk to us about Jewish journalism in general. That's Monday night. And then next Wednesday, 2 weeks from Wednesday, not Wednesday, but the following Wednesday, we will continue our discussion of the great debates that have shaped Jewish life. And our guest will be Professor Joshua Hollow, who is the Dean of HUC, and he's an expert in medieval Jewish history, and he's going to talk to us about mysticism in the Jewish tradition, those who supported mysticism and those who found it less than constructive for the Jewish life. So these are some of the, did you get all that? Did you write it all down? It's a busy place. I want you to learn and be here to learn with us. It's a really wonderful opportunity. Now, I know these chairs are very uncomfortable, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to make you stand up. Louise, yeah? Did you announce Steve Lopez? I did, yeah, twice, yeah. Did I announce Steve Lopez? Yeah. See? Steve Lopez is davening Shabbos. He's going to lead us in Musaf, right? I'm not going to make you stand up because it's really hard to stand up from these chairs. So just turn to the folks next to you and wish them good evening and welcome. So glad you came. Look, I just picked out the best people on the show to learn with you. No, it's nice. These are nice people. All right, now here's what we're going to do. It's hard to put your arms around each other, so just hold hands. And let's make a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu, asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. So without getting in front of our speaker tonight, let me tell you what we're going to do. We're going to jump into the Middle Ages. So we're going to have a giant midlife crisis altogether. Let's talk about the Jewish world 1100. So this is 2020, 920 years ago. Where were Jews 920 years ago? Okay? There were three principal populations of Jews 920 years ago. One population of Jews lived in Europe. In 1100, they would be living in France and Germany. They had not yet moved to Eastern Europe. That came later. That came in the 15th century, 14th century. So France and Germany, and they were suffering from the First Crusades. As the Crusaders were rising armies and sending them to liberate the Holy Land, they decided to start locally and destroy the Jewish communities of Europe. And so there was a tremendous pogrom going on, and the Jews of Europe were suffering from that. The other characteristic of the Jews of Europe is they were living under Christian power, but there was very little cultural conversation between the Christians and the Jews, except when it was just absolutely necessary. Except it was necessary. Now that contrasts sharply with the other two great Jewish communities. The other Jewish community was in Spain and in the East, in Iraq. In those Jewish communities, they were living under Muslim rule.
Muslims had a very different attitude about Jews. They were not nearly as defensive and not nearly as aggressive with their Jewish communities on the whole, as the Christians were. So if we take a snapshot, for example, of one city in Europe, Cordova, Spain. Anyone ever been there, by the way? Yes, Cordova, Spain is a magnificent city. And you need to go. Your rabbi said so you have to listen to me. And in the middle of Cordova, Spain, in the old city of Cordova, okay, there is a mosque. And it's about the most magnificent mosque anywhere outside of Mecca that you can go to. It was built in the 900s, 1000s. It's red and white striped marble. It's huge. I mean, it's a little bigger than Valley Beshalai. It's huge, right? And what's remarkable about this mosque, as you walk through the mosque, anyone been there? What's remarkable about the mosque? Right in the middle of the mosque is a church. I mean, not much, like a little church. A church! Like a cathedral church in the middle of the mosque. Because when the Christians reconquered Cordoba, they didn't want to knock down the mosque. So they built a church mamish right in the middle of the mosque. And this is it's a representation of the life of Cordova. The life of Cordova was a world where three great faith traditions came together and actually spoke to each other. The Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faiths spoke to each other. Very different than Europe, where nobody spoke to each other. These faiths spoke to each other, okay? And the language that they used to speak to each other was philosophy. Philosophy, which is a religiously neutral language, becomes the common parlance for the faiths of the three great Abrahamic faiths to have a conversation. And it's out of this that a number of the greatest Jewish thinkers rise. Because Judaism is a very funny thing. When you isolate it, it stops growing. But when you expose it to the outside, to some sunlight and to some fresh air, remarkable things happen. And tonight we're going to talk about that conversation and who were the principal voices, at least on the Jewish side, in that conversation. And our tour guide for this wonderful sort of exploration of this one moment, this remarkable moment in Jewish life, is an old friend who has now been to VBS enough times that I don't even have to introduce her anymore. She is now officially a member of the shul, right? This is Professor Deena Aranoff, okay? Professor Aranoff is a professor of religion and Jewish thought at the Graduate Theological Union, which is the most important theological stool on the west coast of the United States. It happens to be located in the beautiful town of Berkeley, okay, which if you've ever been to is a very interesting town in itself. And Deena teaches at GTU, and as well as throughout the Bay Area. She holds a PhD in Jewish thought from Columbia University, where she studied with the great scholar Yosef Yerushalmi, among others, right? She's taught here for us many, many wonderful times. And when I ever look for someone to teach Rambam, to teach Maimonides, she's one of the very few people that can make Maimonides penetrable. Because otherwise, he's a really hard guy to learn. But somehow, this woman has figured him out and makes him understandable. And that's why we love bringing her here whenever we want to encounter the Rambam. There's one other thing about Deena Aranoff which makes her quite remarkable, and that she's the niece of these wonderful people sitting right here in the front row. So every time she comes, I make them happy, right? Her proud uncle and aunt get to come and shep nachas at Little Deena, who is now a major professor of Jewish life. So please welcome Professor Deena Aranoff.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, I think I have it. It feels great to be here and to be a part of this warm community that values study and connecting and learning. And thank you, Rabbi Feinstein, for inviting me again into this community. It's like, it's all warmed up already.
So you take your clothes off.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Right.
And I was particularly excited. Let me know and I can, project. I was particularly excited to participate in a series of talks organized around great debates. I think in part because, it's human nature that one of the ways that we think through things and clarify issues is by looking for contrast, kind of oppositional thinking.
Sorry, we have to move the mic maybe up on your sweater.
Absolutely.
Please be closer to your mouth.
Absolutely. How about
Part of the ritual.
something like that?
All right, I've got someone in the tech room.
Okay, great. Let me know how that is.
Is it on? It is on.
It's not amplifying my voice, it's
No,
just
no.
recording it.
It's just recording.
Okay, great, great, wonderful. So when you set up a kind of binary, comparing Hillel, Shammai, Judaism, Christianity, it has the effect of clarifying certain issues. It comes at a price, because quite often when you set up a kind opposition, what you lose is some of the nuance and the gray. Things aren't actually black and white. Things are multifaceted. The individuals or traditions have many aspects to them, many threads woven into the tapestry. But as we try to approach these concepts, it's useful, I think, to set up a contrast, a debate, and then kind of use them to think with. And sometimes the materials that you study, and Rabbi Feinstein let me know what you've been doing thus far in this series, are people who actually weren't engaged directly in debate with one another. We're in a mode of debate, aren't we, in terms of the political moment that we're in. People are debating, they get up together and they debate and disagree, and Judaism is famous for embracing the whole notion of discussion, debate, disagreement. We don't shy away from it. We're like moths to a flame. We seek out that kind of interaction. So sometimes it's real debates, but quite often, and this is what I've noticed in Jewish history, in the history of Jewish thought, it's less about debates that took place in real time and more a kind of typologies that developed over time. And I do think about Hillel and Shammai as an example of this. We'll never really get to know the real person who was Hillel and the person who was Shammai. But after many generations of the teachings of their traditions and their halacha, when they finally do appear on the pages of the Talmud, they have become typologies, approaches that you could come to recognize, almost like schematically. Hillel, the position of Hillel is going to have an emphasis on humanism, on pedagogy, on relating, on feasibility, on compromise. Shammai is going to be an idealist, uncompromising, always reaching for the perfect divine Torah and decree, and not really paying any heed to the limitations of the human condition. And both the Hillel and the Shammai position, we're grateful, they're both on the page, they're both preserved. And we use the Hillel and Shammai position, I think, as something to think with as we explore, for example, halacha. The question is, would Hillel and Shammai actually recognize themselves if they saw who they became in rabbinic Agadah? And we really can't know the answer to that. And tonight, the great debating figures that we're talking about are the figures of the Rambam, or Maimonides, and Yehuda Halevi. And I'm just going to propose that we're going to be reading their writings together and exploring them together, but to some extent, what we're going to explore is what they came to represent in later periods. In the case of Yehuda Halevi and Harry A. Wolfson, he was a great scholar of Maimonides in the late 1800s. In many ways, Harry Wolfson was the one who introduced this great debate of Halevi and Maimonides as two significant typologies in Jewish thought. So while on the one hand we're traveling back in time 900 years, we're also in a certain sense only traveling back in time around 100 years, when it really crystallized that when you think about Jewish thought, you might think about the Rambam as one type and one paradigm, and Yehuda Halevi as another paradigm. And so what I would like to introduce us to just at the start tonight is, what did these figures come to represent? Before we even dive into their materials, what does it mean to say, and this is what Harry Wolfson said in an article over 100 years ago, to say that in Jewish thought you have a Hebraic type and a Hellenistic type. What is he talking about? And the Hebraic type is Halevi, and the Hellenistic type is Maimonides. And I actually also want to think a little bit about how some of these typologies can help us today. So let me just pull back a little bit and introduce us to the thought of Maimonides, of the Rambam, and of Halevi. What they wrote, and then what they came to represent as a type. Okay. So the Rambam, and Rabbi Feinstein did a beautiful job introducing the basic time period of the Rambam. He lived from approximately 1135 to 1204. He was from Cordoba, but as a very young person, fled Spain after the Berber invasion from North Africa, the Almohad invasion, that sent many of the Jews running to North Africa, and he settled in Egypt. He was a brilliant person who excelled in the mathematical and scientific training of his day. He went to what we would say the university and embraced the philosophical worldview of his time. The reason, in my view, the reason he left such a mark on Jewish history is because he took that worldview, which I will review a bit, that Greek philosophical worldview, and he figured out how to integrate that way of thinking about the world with Jewish principles, Torah, and halacha. And in many ways, his genius was his capacity to produce a full account of Judaism that sits beautifully with the critical thinking of the philosophers and the scientists of his time. That capacity, in a certain sense, we think, oh, someone who's very influential must be very original and very radical. Actually, I always like to say the Rambam was very trendy. He was not swimming upstream in his own context. We were talking before the lecture about the fact that the truth is there was some controversy about his philosophy. But when he was writing his philosophy, he was writing in a key, that would be recognized by most of the educated intellectuals in his context, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian. His genius lay in his capacity to synthesize it into a compelling account of revelation, of a basis for Jewish law, for halacha, an account of God that could make sense to somebody who is inclined, has a scientific inclination. And so what the Rambam did as someone who fully embraced the Greek philosophical worldview of his time was to produce a Jewish theology that was in keeping with the general intellectual sensibilities of his age. What were those sensibilities? And this is a very challenging thing to summarize, but I think that there's a way to capture it even in a nutshell. In the philosophical worldview established by Plato and Aristotle, that would be in 4th century BCE, okay, but then fully developed for generations of schools in Athens, Alexandria, and all throughout the Mediterranean, the basic position of the worldview is that what is divine and what is perfect is that which is unchanging, that which is eternally true. If you observe the natural world, you can observe it closely and begin to detect patterns that are constant patterns. Astronomy was the favored science of these kinds of philosophers because if you became educated in the movement of the stars, you were having a sensory experience with your eyes and with your mind. You were having a sensory experience of the unchanging, beautiful patterns of movement in this world. And that was actually for them the closest you could come to, again, a sensory experience and a knowledge, if you will, of the divine. Because everything else that is changing, and the human condition would be the ultimate example of that. I'm leaning on this side of the chair, then I get uncomfortable, I switch to this side of the chair, I need to stretch my body for a brief moment, I'm together as this person, this mortal being, and then quicker than I know it, the life is over, my body goes back into the earth, new life is coming. That kind of flux and change of our material bodies For the philosophers, that is the stuff of the material world. That is not the stuff of the divine. Now, they developed such a perfect notion of God that some people said it's in a way, God almost disappears at this vanishing point. Just as you hit the limits of your sensory capacity to truly know God, that's when you know you've gotten there. And God, to some extent, then recedes really quite into the distance and is completely unlike what we know in more personal experiential terms, our feeling states, our experiences, experience of love, aversion, disgust, food, desire, fear, our personal histories, our family stories, the stories of our entire community, our stories of redemption, of enslavement. All of these are the particulars of our experience. And for the philosophers, while they are real, it's not as if the philosophers are saying none of this is happening. What they would say is, please don't confuse the ebb and flow of our material historical realities with the true movement of the divine. And the more you cultivate that awareness, first of all, they actually thought, if you cultivate that awareness, you might enjoy life a little bit more. Because so much suffering comes from the insistence that our physical experiences somehow have to correspond. You know, we were good in this world. Why are we suffering? You know, we're always looking for that correspondence between our actions and our general state. Our welfare is meant to somehow correspond to our virtue. And the frustration is how rarely that there actually is that kind of correspondence. The philosophers say, don't worry yourself so much. The material world is going to be filled with accident, even to some extent, at times, purposelessness. But if one recognizes that through a kind of contemplative life, one can begin to see an order of things that transcends the flux and the muck of our material lives. And if you go there, well, in a certain sense, you achieve eternal life. Because you've kind of changed over. You're not identifying as fully with your appetites and your body and the limits of this short temporal moment, and you're tapping into something eternal. This basic worldview that has, again, I often am drawn to binaries, actually, to a flaw. This basic worldview that what is divine is unchanging, and to some extent, and unlike the material world, is a worldview that the Rambam embraced, but not just the Rambam, his entire class of intellectuals, and I would say even more broadly, because the Jews in the Islamic world and in the Arabic-speaking world, there was a decent stratum of Jews who were literate, who were reading, who were excited to think philosophically, and who had embraced that way of thinking. The idea of God kind of standing at the door, I sometimes say with party favors, you know, you were good, here you go, you know. To them they thought, I could understand, it might be useful to have that idea, but it's sort of, for them they would say like a pediatric theology. People who don't have that much time to devote to contemplation, we might just throw out this idea. It says God is going to reward and punish, and God is listening, and be careful, God is watching, and take good care. That might have its place, but not because it corresponds to fundamental truths, but only because it's a very useful idea. So the Rambam took this concept of God, and he actually felt that it was important to communicate that concept to as many people as possible. You could say that one of the Rambam is beloved by many, but also there's some ambivalence about him. For example, he wrote a treatise in which he included 13 doctrines of faith. Here are some basic ideas you must subscribe to. There is a God. This God has no parts, no physical attributes, no number can be associated with this God. In fact, the most we could say about this God is what God isn't. That's that vanishing point. God somehow begins when you finally stop trying to liken God to anything you already know. And he issued these theological statements as a kind of doctrine, and many people said, whoa, whoa, even today I'll just say, whoa, Jewish people don't do doctrine. We want you to show up, come to shul, come to mitzvah week and learn about how you can be a good person in this world, but no one is checking your beliefs. You don't have to answer to anyone about that. And so people often don't like the fact that he prescribed a set of beliefs. But I've come to think that the reason he issued those sets of beliefs is because he thought everyone's telling people to believe stuff that isn't true. They're encountering these folk ideas, I said, a kind of pediatric understanding of God, and not everyone can go off to university and observe the movements of the planets and the stars and come to truly understand the divine. And so we're letting everybody walk around with these pet ideas about God that are incorrect, and then they'll never stand a chance of coming to know what is actually true. So it was his attempt to kind of leapfrog over the big obstacle towards philosophical understanding and say, listen, if you know nothing other than this, you will stand a chance at coming to a place of eternal life. Please understand that the divine is. And so I think it's a kind of offering, to allow people to consider philosophical understandings of the divine, because they're not encountering those understandings in the liturgy or so much in the Torah. So it was a kind of egalitarian move, letting everybody in on the philosophical secrets, more than it was some kind of litmus test, like if you're going to count as a Jew, you have to subscribe to these 13 beliefs. I don't think so. I think he wanted to make available to people what he understood to be core Jewish principles and theological principles. He wrote, and there's a reason I'm going to mention his works, because I'll be asking you a question in just a moment. His two key texts are The Guide to the Perplexed, his work of philosophy, in which he does the work I just described of integrating this philosophical worldview with revelation and with Torah and with halakha, Jewish law. He also wrote a 14-volume code of Jewish law called the Mishnah Torah. I'll hold off. I won't say too much. The Mishnah Torah is, again, the mastery of the Rambam. His genius has so much to do with his capacity to produce a comprehensive approach, an integrated approach. Like there are no loose threads. So the Rambam, as a philosopher, felt that human beings, well, forgive me, but basically we're a mess. Even when we're born, we're filled with all kinds of imbalances. We want this, we hate that. We can be a slave to our appetites from birth until death, but we can also condition ourselves so that we're not totally governed by the push and pull of our impulses and our desires, but actually can make decisions from a place of more equanimity, of clear thinking, of awareness, of intelligence. And for the Rambam, the mitzvot, the commandments, are our guide towards conditioning the individual appetite, but also creating a good society that can then enable this clear thinking to take place and ultimately the knowledge of God, like I described. So the 14-volume Code of Jewish Law is a summary, an authoritative summary of the Babylonian Talmudic discussions, the Jerusalem Talmudic discussions, other classical rabbinic texts, the Gaonim that came after the Talmud, the correspondence, the letter writing, halakha as it was lived out in his day. He took all of these discussions and determined what he thought was the appropriate halakha, but not he thought it as a kind of individual, like, oh, I think, but much more because he had, like I said, had integrated what had developed as the consensus and normative halakha, and he put it together in a 14-volume Code of Jewish Law, accessible. If you were a trained rabbi, you had to have Hebrew training, but much more accessible, say, than the Talmud. He wrote a 14-volume Code of Jewish Law. The first two books, the Book of Knowledge and the Book of Love or Adoration, deal somewhat with these philosophical ideas. Those are his two works. Now I'm going to say a little bit about Halevi, and then I'm going to ask a question. Actually, before the life of Maimonides, they might have overlapped for just a few years. Yehuda Halevi, his dates, it's hard to know when he was born, approximately, let's say, 1065 until around 1140. Okay? Born in Spain after the Reconquista has well underway, so the Christians from the north have begun steadily to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim kind of princes and caliphates that were that really organized the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. And Yehuda Halevi is born in the rich environment of the kind of interreligious, artistic, philosophical, linguistic, poetic world of the Golden Age of Spain. But unlike the Rambam, and here's where I think Yehuda Halevi is so interesting. Unlike the Rambam, Yehuda Halevi was uncomfortable in his context. He, almost like, I'm thinking of Camus and the existentialists of the modern period who had that feeling of alienation that sadly I think it's become sort of a common state of mind for many people. But Yehuda Halevi's writings again and again express his sense as a Jew of being dislocated, not in the right place, not in the Holy Land of Israel, not in Zion. Yes?
Where in Spain did he live?
Toledo was his principal location, but he was somewhat itinerant, and he eventually traveled to Israel. It's not clear whether he made it there. If he did make it there, it was a very brief stay before he seemed to have suffered some kind of early death, possibly even a violent death. But there's so much legend about his death. But he has poems that he wrote from the ships, from traveling on the Mediterranean. But he, unlike Maimonides, who I would really say was of a piece with his time and his context, Yehuda Halevi was writing from that place of feeling feeling like he's outside, not quite where he should be, not really fulfilling what it is to be a Jew, because it's like a plant that's been planted in the wrong soil. And he wrote a lot of poetry, much of which was preserved because it became part of liturgy, but much of it was not preserved and only recovered in the Cairo Geniza discoveries. This was something new to me. I think of Yehuda Halevi as such a canonical Hebrew poet from the Middle Ages. I thought that his stuff had been in circulation continuously from his life until today. But actually, most of what we have of his poetry is what we recovered in the late 1800s when the materials from that Geniza, that cloister of ancient texts, was discovered and began to circulate. He wrote poetry, but his signature principal work is the Kuzari, which is, talk about a great debate, the literary arrangement of the Kuzari is a debate, effectively, being staged before an imagined king of the Khazar kingdom. There was a Khazar kingdom in Central Europe, Russia, and it may actually be the case that there was some interest in the Jewish faith on the part of a Khazar king in the 900s and some kind of conversion that took place at the royal court. It's hard to really historically verify this, but lore and legend around the conversion of the Khazar king to Judaism was well known in Spain. Yehuda Halevi used that incident, even if it's a legend or somewhat legendary, he used that incident to create a literary work, the Kuzari, of this king seeking a religious life of meaning and interviewing different kind of prospects, a philosopher, a Muslim, a Christian, although to be honest, it's just the beginning of the work that includes all these other options. Most of the work is the conversation between the Jewish speaker, the Chaver. I don't know, it's written in Arabic. If anybody here has Arabic and knows the original of the Kuzari, please let me know during discussion or now. But the chaver, the Jewish fellow, the friend, the speaker, is elaborating upon Judaism before this king, the Khazar king. And here's where Halevi was really, as I would say, swimming upstream, which is Harry Wolfson's term. Halevi presents Judaism in the Kuzari not in the terms of his day, not by taking Judaism and kind of making sense of it in philosophical or enlightened terminology, but actually in a much more romantic, experiential way. The Chaver, and we'll read it together, as he presents Judaism to the king, he doesn't make reference to objective philosophical positions and shows how Judaism can work with those positions. He summons only the experience of the Jewish people, the experience of their redemption, the traditions that have been passed from generation to generation, their collective experience at Sinai, the uniqueness of the people as a collective, the uniqueness of the land of Israel and of Zion. In other words, a defense of Judaism that, well, what I want to say, it doesn't translate well. He's not trying to translate Judaism into a framework that would be understood by outsiders. He's enlivening the interior sensibility of what it is to be Jewish based on an experience of a common history and a common narrative, and that's it. That's the defense of the, quote, despised faith of Judaism in the Kuzari. So here is a question I wanted to ask you, and then we're going to do some close reading. I understand these were just very kind of very quick reviews of these thinkers and their writings. But many of you, and I know some of you here, have studied some of these writers before, so I'm going to lean on that a little bit here as well. If you were going to a desert island, okay, and if I may speak to, if anyone is listening out here, go with me on this experiment, okay? You're headed to a desert island, and you can only bring with you for reading material, for your sustenance, for your intellectual life, etc. Would you bring the works of the Rambam, or would you bring the works of Halevi? So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is take a minute to share your answer with whoever is nearby, okay? And if it's a group of three, you can try to do it in three, or you can lean over it and find somebody. But pair up for a moment, if you will, and answer for one another, based on what we've talked about. Which writer would you want to have with you for, your end of days on a desert island? Okay, please, 2 minutes. Okay.
If I might.
Yes.
If you had an intransigent teenager who told you, I don't want to be Jewish anymore, who would you rather that teenager talk to, Halevi or the Rambam?
That's how do you transmit Judaism?
Because who do you think would be more persuasive to that teenager, the philosophical Rambam or the romantic Halevi?
Can you bring that up? Because no, it's not a contradiction. That's where I went in the end. Should I turn this off? Okay, but I was going to say, I almost went there, but I'm so used to being sensitive to not everyone is a parent, not everyone has. Okay. Okay.
I think that I love your interpretation of the Rambam. I think that you're so much nicer a person than he was. That you're down the cuff screws. I think you're being much too nice to him. I think he was much more ferocious and elitist than you're making him out to be. And I think that you're right in to say that these Karim were an egalitarian move. But they were an egalitarian move because he had such little regard for common people and the common religion that he said, if I'm going to give you Narishkeit,
I better give you a higher quality Narishkeit than the stuff your rabbis are giving you. Rather than, I'm going to share with you philosophical truths. Because the guide, after all, was written for one guy.
Yeah, but the Mishnah Torah's Sefer Hamadah is beautiful.
It is.
And it's for the...
You're exactly right. But it doesn't prove stuff. It just gives you apodictically. You got to believe this, right? So philosophically, you're wrong. You're not wrong. It's just, I think you're just nicer than he is. I mean, but he has this nasty habit of saying, "Fools believe this. Idiots believe this. Morons believe this."
Women and children.
No, he's not so down on women. But
No, he
fools.
does. No,
I know.
that's his phrase.
But he's meaner than you are. You're much nicer. You're a better teacher.
I might be more pedagogically inclined.
Yeah.
In terms of the timing, what do you think? No, but it ends at. First of all, I want to hear from you. I like the Q&A.
So what I would suggest you do is go a little while.
Okay.
I like to give them a break because they usually get a coffee and a cookie or a bathroom.
Okay.
And then we come back and you and I will have some schmooze.
Great.
And
So-
we kill at 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock they all fall asleep.
Okay.
I don't fall asleep.
So, this is way past my bedtime. So, what time should the break happen?
So anytime in the next 20 minutes.
Okay. Like 8:15?
Yeah,
Okay.
8:10.
8:10.
Yeah, something like whenever you're ready.
Okay. So let's
Okay,
come
ladies
back
and
together.
I forgot to tell Professor Aranoff that we're a really good schmoozing group.
Right.
And if you let this group schmooze, they will schmooze. The answer to your question is, if you have to be on a desert island, bring this group. They'll schmooze.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you about a point you brought up.
We're going to pass the mic around just so the whole world can hear you. Okay? It doesn't amplify here. It's just so that the whole world can hear you.
So when you were introducing Rambam, what I thought was very fascinating was he seems to have a lot of parallels to Spinoza in the way he thinks about God. And I don't know if I was off on that or if I was on the money on that.
Harry Wolfson spent a lifetime making that case. Harry Wolfson was the first Jewish studies professor in America. He was a Lithuanian rabbi and professor of Jewish studies at Harvard. Harvard didn't want to have a Jewish studies professor, but somebody gave them an awful lot of money to hire this guy. And Harry Wolfson spent an entire career proving exactly that from Philo to Maimonides to Spinoza, the Jewish philosophical tradition shaped European thought. So the answer is, yes, go learn Harry Wolfson. You write a PhD for me, we'll work this out, okay? It's a great, great answer. Pop, yeah.
What do you mean by that the Rambam was influenced by the Greek concept of the world?
When the Rambam was participating in a trend in his day of thinking about the world in this Greek philosophical...
What is the Greek philosophy? What she said, which is that divinity, what's godly, what's God, is perfect. And what's perfect is what never changes. And if something is changing, like you, for example, in us, what changes? Emotions change. I'm angry, I'm sad, right? I'm tired, I'm up, I'm down. Emotions, bad. Reason never changes. So reason is the part of us that's godly, and emotions are the part of you which are just human. Okay? Things that are changing are just material. Things that are eternal and never changing are divine and perfect. So you can imagine then, if you start with that idea, the whole world falls into place. Right? The problem is when you open the Bible, is God changing or is God eternal? God's changing, which means that when I read the Bible, I have to read it with very different eyes. Because it seems to me that God, is changing all the time in the Bible. So Maimonides says, no, you're reading wrong, you see? And that's where you get a really interesting midrash on the Bible. But think about this idea of change and not change. Okay? Okay, tell you what, let's do this. I know you have lots of questions. I got lots of questions. But I want to let Professor Aranoff finish this part of the talk, and then we'll come back after the break, and we got 12 hours to ask her questions before we put her on a plane back to Berkeley, okay?
Great. Though I was curious if anyone just could briefly make a case for wanting one or the other book with them on the desert island. We have about these two cases, and then we'll, yeah.
What I thought was that if you're in a culture with other people, then you would want Maimonides. But if you're sitting alone and you're by yourself, you want the pure Judaism. And that's so on the island, I would want Halevi.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. One more.
But you know, Maimonides was an esteemed physician. And he went to see the king after he had treated all day his patients. So being a physician, maybe it'd be a good thing to have him along on a desert island.
That's great.
Philosophy, my back hurts.
Pardon? Yes.
What do you got to help me sleep?
Not of such excellence as my mother.
Yeah, well, my thought was I'd like to have the Rambam along with me because he laid out all the mitzvot in a semi-organizational order, listed all the kosher foods. So by having that, I would know what I can eat on the island.
Yes. I mean, I was going to say that it was cheating if your answer was, well, 14 volumes. There's a lot more reading material. But the Mishnah Torah really does present beautifully the fullness of Jewish life and practice. And so as a guide for that, it's wonderful. Though then I come back to your point about isolation. If on this desert island you're totally isolated, so much of Jewish life is about a communal practice. It might be harder to apply a lot of the halacha that he presents there. So Harry Austin Wolfson, as Rabbi Feinstein talked about, was the scholar who worked very hard on lining up Maimonides along this line of Greek philosophical thinking and bringing it all the way up to the modern period. And he introduced Halevi in this important article that he wrote 120 years ago, Halevi as the Hebraic counterpoint. You use the language of the pure Jewish, the Hebraic counterpoint to this more assimilationist Greek thinking approach of the Rambam. Wolfson, if you read his piece, it's very clear that what he favors is Halevi's approach in that it preserves, I think what he would say is a certain life force, the kind of the pulse, the beating heart of the Jewish people. And I think that Wolfson also enjoyed the way in which what Halevi was doing was resisting fitting in. And Halevi, I mean, there is almost something a little bit like, we were talking about teenagers during the break, a little bit like I don't quite fit in like the way a teenager might not feel like they can fully be a part of something. They're really feeling how outside they are from certain social lives. And Halevi, his poetry, his pain comes from that feeling of being in exile, not comfortable even in Spain, despite all of its riches and all of the precious cultural opportunities, and despite all of that, he would have been happy instead were he just to be able to see the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem. And that's what he articulates so beautifully in what probably his most famous, he penned the most famous words of his. So what I'd like to do now is read a little bit before our break, a little bit from the Rambam, a little bit from Halevi, to flesh out these generalities and to examine them and see what we think of them.
What's the name of the essay by Wolfson?
It's funny, I have it, I think I even brought it here, but it's called Halevi and Maimonides, Types of Jewish Thinking or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let me just, no, here it is. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Maimonides and Halevi, a study in typical Jewish attitudes towards Greek philosophy in the Middle Ages, from 1912. So I'll give it to you before you leave. Okay.
Okay.
So let's start with the poem. The poem, and forgive me, the handout, each time I visit here, I note to myself, I'm going to do a better job on the handout. I'm going to have it be bold font, bigger font, stronger font. And then I'm at the copy machine an hour before my flight. And this is what happens. So forgive me, really forgive me. And I will read slowly, and because I know that the font is difficult to read. But on one side, it says Halevi Kuzari. And at the bottom of that is, and you didn't get one, but there's many, okay. At the bottom of that is some Hebrew text and some English text. I photocopied this from an anthology of Hebrew verse by Carmi, a beautiful anthology of Hebrew verse from biblical material through medieval and modern poems. And he has a full collection of Halevi poems. And this is the poem that Halevi wrote that captured his pain at being dislocated, not in the right place, in exile. And I'll read the Hebrew, and then I'll read the English, and those of you with Hebrew can perhaps make other suggestions about the translation. Libi b'mizrach, va'anochi b'sof ma'arav. איך אטמא את אשר אוכל ואיך יערב. איכה אשלם נדרי ואסרי בעוד ציון בחבל אדום ואני בחבל ערב. יקל בעיני עזוב כל טוב ספרד, כמו יקר בעיני ראות עפרות דביר נחרב. In the English here that Carmi wrote, my heart is in the east, and I am at the edge of the west. How, then, can I taste what I eat? How can I enjoy it? How can I fulfill my vows and pledges while Zion is in the domain of Edom and I am in the bonds of Arabia? It would be easy for me to leave behind all the good things of Spain. It would be glorious to see the dust of the destroyed shrine.
One thing I want to make note. The English captures the gist of the Hebrew, but half of the meaning is in the Hebrew. I mean, just to give you an example, the word how, when he asks the question how, the Hebrew is eicha. Eicha is the first word of the Hebrew book of Lamentations. And on Tisha B'Av, when we sit on the floor and remember the destroyed temple, you start with Eicha. Yeah, how could it be? So when he uses the word how, Eicha, he's pointing to that biblical text, because he is a refugee from the destroyed temple. Okay? When he talks about Edom, that the east is in the realm of Edom. Edom are the descendants of Esau. And in rabbinic text, that's Rome. The Crusaders went and took Jerusalem. He's living in the Muslim world. The Christians own the Jerusalem. So the Christians own half the world. The Muslims own the other half of the world. And we Jews, we don't have any place in the world. So the Hebrew, you have to know that the Hebrew is you got about half of it from the English. The rest of it, you got to go learn the Hebrew language. Okay? I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. That's the kind of close reading I was hoping to engage in, and that is beautiful. And even if you just look at the Hebrew, if you have a little bit of Hebrew, also the art of this poem. So the last two lines in the Hebrew, if you look on the page, even if you don't have any Hebrew, please have a look with me. You'll see that they look like the same word, yekal and yekar, a very tiny little change. And that he's using that artistry. Look at the difference. It would be the first word, yekal. It would be light and easy for me to leave all of this. I could leave all of the beauty and the goodness of Sfarad, of Spain, and everything it represents, as it would be so dear to me, yekar, so precious to me, even just to see the ashes and dust of the destroyed sanctuary that is the temple. I mean, the acute sense of living too far from where he belongs. And that sensibility, I think it's why his poetry, he wrote, almost included it, but Tzion halo tish'ali l'shlom asirayich. Tzion, won't you please ask for the welfare of yours who have been taken captive elsewhere? Like a longing, such a longing that he up and attempted to move to Israel. And the feelings in this poem, in many ways, help us understand how he wrote the Kuzari, which he did not write in beautiful poetic Hebrew. He wrote it in Judeo-Arabic, meaning the letters, the script of it are Hebrew, at least as it was recorded, but the language itself is Arabic. That was the language of conversation and even of literature. It's the language of the Guide to the Perplexed. It's the language of most of the correspondence that they found in the Geniza. Jews were Arabic speaking, and they were the majority of world Jewry until that move towards Poland and the population explosion that happened there. So he's writing in Arabic, though the letters are Hebrew as it's transcribed, and he's defending Judaism before this king who's an outsider. But the irony is, in the Kuzari, he's not trying to define Judaism in terms that the king might recognize or even know intellectually. Instead, what he says again and again on the pages is, I'll tell you, what Judaism is a common history. It's a bundle of ancestors who had certain experiences, including a collective experience of divine revelation, sacred laws that are given to the people and are therefore binding upon them. And this could make some people comfortable and some people uncomfortable. He insists that the lineage itself of the Jews is unique, the genealogy of it, that there's a specialness to the Jewish people that tracks through the biblical genealogy all the way through till the people today. And he bases Judaism in this cluster of experiences. And I want us to see this together and link it up actually to something Rabbi Feinstein said earlier. So the excerpt from the Kuzari is on the same page. I included on the left-hand side the kind of setup of the Kuzari, which is the king of the Khazars, has this dream. The dream is sending him this message that while the intentions are pleasing, the king of the Khazars is being told something about his intentions are good, but his way of acting is not pleasing. So he goes out to discover what form of religious practice is pleasing and good. Clearly, whatever temples that he had in place and the offerings that he was making were not pleasing. So he's particularly interested in what form his religious life should take. He's not after certain metaphysical truths or understanding. He's trying to figure out what is a good form of religious life. The philosopher makes a presentation, the Muslim, the Jew, the Christian make presentations. It's the chaver in the Hebrew. In the English here, it's the rabbi, and the English is from this great collection of 3 Jewish philosophers. I'll look up whose English translation this is in a moment. Yeah. He names the Jewish speaker as the rabbi, and let's just read this together. So this is really paragraph 11. It looks like Roman numeral 2, but it's paragraph 11 on the right-hand side, is the first real substantive proclamation of the Jewish speaker. And here's what he says. The Khazar king says, tell me a little bit about your religion. He says, I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, who led the Israelites out of Egypt with signs and miracles, who fed them in the desert and gave them the Holy Land after having made them traverse the sea and the Jordan in a miraculous way, who sent Moses with his law and subsequently thousands of prophets who confirmed his law by promises to those who observed and threats to the disobedient. We believe in what is contained in the Torah, a very large domain. And I'll read a little bit further in the next paragraph. The chaver, the Jewish speaker, is trying to explain to the Khazar king how the Jewish people have retained and transmitted a set of experiences from one generation to the next. And so it's less about presenting convincing, objective arguments and more about personal experience. And so, for example, he talks about how in the Torah, when God announces God's self to the people in the Ten Commandments, God doesn't say, I am the God who created the heaven and the earth. God doesn't take a kind of universal introduction. But instead, God says, hi, you remember me? I'm the God of your ancestors. Like when Moshe says to God, I'm afraid to go to these people. They're not going to believe me. Who should I say is sending them? And God says, tell them, I'm that being that was in conversation with their ancestors. That person, that familiar person. I mean, Rabbi Feinstein was saying, when you open up the Torah, God is changing, exactly. God is a personality, a loving, listening, at times angry, devoted, historical force, creating the world, redeeming the people from Egypt, issuing prophecy to Moshe, dictating, as it were, the Ten Commandments. I mean, the Rambam has a lot of work to do in the Guide to the Perplexed to work out how the biblical text aligns with the Greek worldview. And that's in many ways the work that he has to do in the Guide to the Perplexed. For Halevi, that whole cluster, for what for the Rambam is a bit of a problem, for Halevi is the core of the system. This is it. We had this experience. And if we didn't have it directly, our ancestors did, and they passed it down through the generations, and it's therefore binding upon us. We have a common genealogy and a common history. We have a special relationship with God. And in the Kuzari, everything flows from this. There's a section on the special qualities of the land of Israel, the special qualities of the Jewish people, the special experiences they have with the divine that binds them to the Torah and to the community. This mode, for a philosopher and a scholar like Harry Wolfson, was a very compelling mode that I think Wolfson thought had an authenticity to it, like a voice of experience. I'm not going to take Judaism and translate it for you so that it sits nicely in your critical scientific worldview. I'm going to make it untranslatable. I'm going to make you uncomfortable, because, and I included that paragraph. At the end of that paragraph, the Chaver talks about how all of the people of Israel, first through personal experience, and afterward through an uninterrupted tradition, which is equal to experience. It's that experience and the tradition that binds the people. So then the king, the Khazar king, asks the question, then your belief is confined to yourselves? And to some extent, the Khazar king is a bit shocked, because what most people were trying to do in these days was to show how beautifully their religious system could sit with the philosophical worldview of their time. And I actually, as you know, I love the Rambam. And the way in which he took the critical, rational worldview, which to some extent still is how many of us think. And he brought Judaism, he integrated those worldviews in a way that's very compelling. What the Rambam is doing is saying, sorry, I'm not going to, it's sort of like I'm not going to change my money. I'm showing up with my shekels. You're assuming I'm going to want to kind of, what's the word when you change your money? I'm going to change my money into dollars because I can do much more with dollars. He said, not interested. I work in shekels. That's it. Doesn't translate. So then the Khazar king says, well, then that means, like, only Jews can have this faith. You're not even interested in presenting it to me as a compelling option. What if I wanted to convert? How is conversion even possible then, if you're telling me that the core of this religion is common experience and tradition and history? I don't have those things. And actually, the response of the rabbi, he says, okay, this is the last English paragraph right before the poem. Any Gentile who joins us sincerely shares our good fortune, but he is not equal to us. And you should know this is not the dominant position in Judaism. This is not the Talmudic position. Although good, we can debate that too. But I include a comment like this. I want to provide a little bit of context. Rarely is a statement like this, unqualified statement saying, though you might convert, there's no real way to graft yourself on to the body of the Jewish people. In the Kuzari, I would say the Kuzari might be the most total presentation of that worldview. And Rabbi Feinstein, it's true, I like to be a generous reader of these materials.
No, I love it.
My generous reading of this material is, think about Yehuda Halevi here. What he's trying to say is, we're a people, okay? Like a family that has a story. And yes, you can come into the family. Please come into the family. But you didn't have the experience that this family had. You will acquire it. And now I'm doing my generous reading. But he is drawing a line because he insists. It doesn't translate. This is not a set of abstract beliefs that anyone can sign on to. That we're going to walk around and say, do you want to believe in this God? It's not a theology. It's not a static set of principles. It's a history. And God is completely intertwined with that history, responding at every turn like a lover. And that's Halevi. And you can feel his inner turmoil about where he lives and how he's living and where the Jews are in history. He lives it out. He uproots himself and goes on his own diaspora, as it were, in his attempt to go back to Israel. So that's a little bit of Halevi, and I know that we're due for a little break so that we can be revived for our discussion. So what I'll do is I'm going to hold off on our close reading of the Rambam, and maybe it'll come up in our discussion after the break.
Good, thank you. Wonderful, yeah? Good.
All right, so here's your instruction. We don't have a lot of time, so we want to spend as much time as possible. So run outside, get a coffee, get a tea, get a cookie, use the bathroom, come back in 10 minutes, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, wonderful. I'm sorry I keep interrupting you.
Oh, you're not this is beautiful.
I have so much interrupting.
Dialogue. It's the best. Thank you. It's past my bedtime too. Wonderful to see you.
Yeah, a couple times, yeah.
She's wonderful.
Yes, I'm good, yeah.
Really wonderful. I love her. Delicious. She is.
I love having you right here. You're the best. This whole row. Oh, I know a lot of people. It's late. It's past my bedtime. It is. Thank you for coming out. Thanks for coming out. I love being here. Thank you. Good night.
Because I think for this very reason, because
It's so nice to see you.
you build a relationship to experience, not through ideas. Experience. It's the experiences that are
Where?
I think it's a wonderful question. Very good question.
I'm in the West. Whenever I read that poem, I think about having not It's true.
I guess I take out my mother.
Is that true that an adopted child can never be your child?
It's a funny thing. The whole book is about this rabbi trying to convert this non-Jewish king. And he sets up a theology, an idea, which prevents the guy from converting. I mean, in a certain way, it's like complete opposite, right? He says, like, you'll never be one of us. Yeah, maybe a little bit, but never completely. It's a very interesting book. And it's a very lovely book. She's a good teacher. You write to her?
right question. Spinoza is in the same. Wolfson proved that Philo, Maimonides, and Spinoza are the great friends in Jewish, in the effort to integrate Jewish and Greek thought through the Middle Ages.
So I think
It starts with this guy Philo, the first century Alexandria. It reaches its peak in Maimonides, and it finishes with the climax of this Spinoza.
I think when it was Professor was talking about the idea that God is more of a constant thought process versus our experiences. That's very controversial.
Yes. This is the great controversy of the Middle Ages. How do you prove the truth of Judaism? Do you prove it by empirical ideas? Or do you prove it by the history of our experience? And by the way,
A lot of faith is based on emotion, and it's not based on. I think for me, at least when I'm starting to pray, I use my emotions to get to where.
listen, and that's exactly the right question. In the end, what's more powerful in determining your own personality? The big ideas that you think, or the experiences that you have? Right? And when you think about it, it's a really good question, right? There are big ideas and there are convictions and values, which are very abstract. But in the end, you are the person you are because you were born to these wonderful parents. You are the person you are because you grew up with your brothers. You're the person you are because you had certain teachers.
Let me
You
write
are the
it
person
down.
you are because you have a certain circle of friends. Take any one of those and change them, and you will be a different person. And that's what he's trying to say. That's what he's trying to say. In the end, I can't prove to you the truth of a religious faith based on abstract ideas, because that's not the way people are shaped.
SHI.
It's very interesting.
About prayer. Like,
Prayer?
what would prayer?
He would say it like this. He would say, the highest form of prayer is philosophical contemplation. You find a quiet place where you can sit and think deeply about God and the world and yourself. A sort of form of meditation. That's too hard for most people. So for most people, we have a prayer book, a cantor, and a rabbi, which is a sort of compromise to people's need for drama and ritual and theater. But the best prayer is not wordy prayer. The best prayer is just internal, quiet, and contemplation. And he writes this. That's what he says. He says, prayer is simply a compromise with people's weakness and their inability to sit quietly for 5 minutes. He really is. I told Deena, she's much nicer than Maimonides. Maimonides is a real elitist, and he really has disdain for the rest of us. Because he's like, I don't know, have you ever had a professor in college who knew that he was much smarter than everybody in the room and just told you over and over again that you're going to cheat all the time? You know, I had that guy, just Deena, my wife, had a professor. He was a famous Jewish studies professor at Brandeis University. His name was Marvin Fox. F-O-X, right? So he was such an arrogant schmuck that everyone turned their papers in, and on the cover page of their papers, they wrote his name as F-X. Because he was such an arrogant schmuck.
Yeah.
He knew he was much smarter than you are, and he wouldn't forget to tell you that every single day. That's what I want. A little regard for folk religion, for certain people's weaknesses. He dumps on people all the time. Hey, Brian.
How do you know so many interesting people?
Isn't she great?
Yeah. Where do you come up with all these people?
You collect them. I have a collection of them on my computer. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we got a lot to learn. Let's go. Bring your cookies, bring your coffee. Let's sit down. Let's turn the heat back on. Come on, let's go. Yo, you got a question. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you'll get your question.
It wasn't a question. When I was in Cordoba, they told us that the Christians destroyed a certain section of the mosque to put their church in, so I hardly
Yeah,
thought
yeah,
it was a.
but it's a very interesting.
But it
as
hardly
you walk
was a
through it, no, it's hardly.
common.
It's a, yeah, but it's so interesting to walk through the mosque,
God.
and in the middle of it,
I was shocked.
it's a huge church.
I was shocked.
And the mosque is horizontal, the church is vertical, the mosque is
It was
colorful.
so
the
upsetting.
church-
I was
yes.
like, oh my God.
I had the same feeling.
So when you said what you said, I was like,
What is this doing here? Right, exactly. I had the same feeling. I had the same exact
all right, as long as we're on the same page. All right.
All right, come on in. We got work to do. Come on. Come on, come on, come on. Let's go, let's go, let's go. We have all of medieval Jewish thought to master, and we only have 35 minutes to do it. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
I lost my little.
You lost your notes?
There we go.
There you go. All right, everybody good? Everybody good? How you doing? Okay, everybody okay? So this week the president got impeached and the Houston Astros got busted. Right? We should get our World Series trophy back. It's really freezing cold, yeah.
They're coming in.
They're coming in, yeah. As soon as they come in, we'll close the door. Close the door. This has been great. Thank you so much. This is just wonderful. Come on in, come on in, come on in, come on in, come on. I got lots of pages. We got an awful lot to learn.
I think he's just getting started.
You can ask. Go ahead.
Please.
I have a friend whose son started a chabad.
Yeah.
And he went to the yeshiva after he was very in his late teens. Then he also went to Israel and stayed in one of their settlements. Came back and he married somebody from Chabad, but they would not let him marry somebody who had grown up in Chabad.
Yeah, that's very true. That happens. Yeah.
Only somebody who would.
So those distinctions are operating internally.
Which is similar to what you said.
Very true. That's a very, very good example. So I want you to imagine the following scenario. You have an intransigent teenager in your life. Some of us do. And your intransigent teenager says, I don't believe in any of this stuff. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in Torah. I'm not going to synagogue anymore. I don't want to be Jewish. Why should I be Jewish? Why should I believe? And you throw your hands up in the air and you say, what am I supposed to do with this kid? Pain in the ass kid, right? So you say, I got an idea. There are two great teachers here in Encino, Rambam and Halevi. I'm going to send the kid to each of them. Okay? I'm going to send this intransigent, questioning, critical teenager to Dr. Rambam and to Dr. Halevi. Okay? What do you suppose each of them would say? What would Rambam say to the kid? The kid's going to say, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the Torah. I don't believe in prayer. I don't want to be a Jew. Why should I believe in any of that stuff? How would the Rambam answer his question? Why? You're right. Why would he say that? You're exactly right. No. See, excuse me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be cruel. You're right the first time. Maimonides would say, yes, you have to. Not because it's our tradition, but because, why? Yo? That's the second thing he'd say. Or the third thing he'd say. What's the first thing he'd say? You have to believe in it because it's true. Yes, it's true. For Maimonides, believing in God is like believing that 2 + 2 is 4. For Maimonides, it is a truth. Being Jewish is not an identity, it's not a culture, it's not a peoplehood, all those things that we're used to. It's not a tradition. It's truth. It's this saying I don't believe in God is like saying 2 + 2 = 5. What the Greek way is that idea that you have to believe in truth. So the Rambam would say to the kid, look, let me show you why there's nothing else in the world that you can believe. This is the only truth that there is. Then he would say, because it's the only truth, now you get your idea, because it's the only truth you can believe, the laws of Torah are the only way to live a life, because they're based on truth. That's the Maimonides. So why does Maimonides believe in God? Because it's scientific truth. Okay? Now, the kid says, thank you very much, Dr. Maimonides, and he goes across the street to Dr. Halevi. And the kid says to Dr. Halevi, I don't believe in God. How do I know there's a God? What would Dr. Halevi say? He'd say, we believe there's God. And the kid would say, how come you believe there's God? Do you have proof that there's God? And Halevi would say, better than proof. We met him. And the kid would say, what? Yeah, we met God. We shook his hand. You were there too, remember? We stood at Mount Sinai, and God said hello, and we were all there. And the kid would say, wait, I don't remember that. Well, of course you do. It's written in the Torah, and the Torah is the story that our people have always passed down, and it's a true story. We met God. We had that experience. You see the difference between the two? So for Maimonides, it's the scientific truth, and for Halevi, it's the experiential, historical narrative. Now, the irony is, if it wasn't an intransigent teenager, but someone coming from outside of Judaism thinking of converting, who would have a better chance converting him, Halevi or Rambam? Rambam, because he speaks the scientific language. The funny thing about the Kuzari, it's the story of how a king gets converted to Judaism, but the argument that Halevi makes is the exact opposite argument you'd make to a person who wants to convert to Judaism. Because he says, well, we were there. You weren't. You'll never be completely Jewish. You're a great recruiter, you know? What kind of a recruiter are you, you know? And he says it's our story, but you understand what he's trying to do. He's trying to say, look, you can't use somebody else's truth system to prove the truth of our Torah. Right? You can't do it. And this is the kind of truth that can only be experienced. So everybody got that? That's a quick summary of what Dr. Aranoff laid out for us, okay? All right, do you want to read a Harambam? Or you want to do some questions? We do some questions. Let's read a Rambam, yeah.
Okay, so I'll pick up on what you're sharing. So the side of the sheet that is selections from the Rambam, I find myself contemplating the subject matter. I'm contemplating.
That's what the Rambam would have you do.
What to do. Okay, so we'll start with what's on the left-hand side, which is selections from the Mishnah Torah. I mentioned the Mishnah Torah is the 14-volume code of Jewish law. The first volume is called the Book of Knowledge, and he lays out a lot of his philosophical ideas there, as well as an approach to Jewish ethics and the place of the mitzvot, the commandments, especially in conditioning the human being, both the individual and society, in such a way that you can live in harmony and in balance and in health. He uses a lot of medical metaphors in his discussions. But they're more than just metaphors. This is what I mean about the integrated approach of Maimonides. What he understood to be true about the human body, that it functions best when there is balance. And so in the Greek medical system, if your body is overly moist or warm, then the medicine would be something dry and cooling, all in that effort to bring the person to a state of balance. That model of health of the body, he applies directly and explicitly to how the mitzvot work on the human condition. So if human beings are born, and this is kind of fearful, with the hands clasped, and will I have enough, and do I have enough, and mine, anyone with toddlers in your lives know the mine instinct. Then what the Rambam says is the Torah comes along and requires excessive amounts of giving in order just to help a person to arrive at a free and optimal relationship to property and material possessions, where you can decide, do I need this? I have enough. I can let it go. I can give it away. He thinks that human beings are not actually born that way. We're born with an imbalanced inclination towards possessiveness, and the Torah has to overdo it. That's what he says. It overdo. When you're harvesting your grapes, don't take the full. You can take the full bunches, but don't run back and pick off all the ones that you've missed. And if you're harvesting the fields, don't harvest the edges. You know, pe'ah, which is the edges, is often, at least in my mind, I often imagined it as a little square of the field. But actually, pe'ah in the biblical text means a little bit more like the edges. And so it's more like the grapes analogy. They're saying when you're harvesting the field, it's actually an opportunity to condition your nature. Human nature is going to be to harvest it all the way up to the edge, right to the very last stalk. Don't do that. Leave the edges of the field for the poor. And you forgot a sheaf, you harvested, you bound a whole sheaf, and you forgot it in the field, leave it, forget about it. I sometimes compare that to, I do my best, but it's a spiritual practice. At the end of the day, when you go into your bag and you have all of that change, I think those are the grapes, the single grapes at the end of the day, that in a monetary economy, the instinct, I can put it together and say, oh, great, I can feed the meter with this one, I can do this. It's actually not mine. And the Torah is trying to say that instinct, oh, I can use this change. Actually, it's tzedakah. It's not yours. And give a tenth of it, give a tenth and keep giving. So the Rambam is saying all of that giving is to correct for the extremely fearful natural state of human beings when it comes to our material possessions. So ideally, says the Rambam, if you live a life where you're practicing the commandments of the Torah, you get to a place of virtue where you're following the ways of the Torah and the balanced golden mean, not because there's going to be a reward or a punishment, an immediate divine response, actually through no external motive whatsoever. You simply move through the world with a kind of beautiful grace by virtue of having been conditioned by the life of the mitzvot. And I'll come to it, that is how he ends the book of knowledge, Sefer Hamadah in the Mishnah Torah, where he says there's a phase of Torah life that could be described as living the Torah laws, living them out from fear. I'm afraid if I don't do it, I'll be punished. I have to do it. The image of the teenager saying, I don't want to do this stuff, and you have to do it. He actually thinks there's a place for that. There might very well be a phase of life where the best that you can do in order to get people in the practice is to threaten them with punishment. However, or reward them with raisins and almonds, okay? But eventually, ideally, a person, and now I'm coming back, eventually gets to a place of relating to God and to others, to the world, from a place of love, which he equates with knowledge. So I know that's a little bit abstract, so let's see it on the page. He says, and I'll mostly reading here, whoever serves God out of love, that person occupies themselves with the study of the law of Torah and the fulfillment of the commandments, and walks in the paths of wisdom, impelled by no external motive whatsoever, moved neither by fear of calamity nor by the desire to obtain material benefits. Such a person does what is truly right because it is truly right, and ultimately happiness comes to that person as a result of this conduct. What the Rambam is doing in a very subtle way is he's saying all of that language of you'll get a reward, you'll get a punishment, you will, the rains will come. What he's actually trying to say is all of that language of the Torah, there's a truth in it. But the kernel of truth that's in it is to say that if you've lived a balanced life and cultivated this kind of awareness that the Rambam thinks is primary, awareness of the divine, your actions in this world will have, like I said, a beauty to them. You're aligned. And as a result, you will have a good life. But he doesn't necessarily mean good, like everything good will come to you. But he means there'll be a satisfaction, a presence, an awareness that with which you move through the world. And that is the kind of happiness that he really values. This standard is indeed a very high one. Not every sage attained it. It was the standard of the patriarch Abraham, who God called his lover, because he, meaning Abraham, served God only out of love. It is the standard which God, through Moses, bid us achieve, as it is said, and you shall love the Lord your God. When one loves God with the right love, that person will straightaway observe all the commandments out of love. This is an aspiration. I mean, the Rambam is basically saying it's almost impossible to get there. Perhaps Abraham got there as the great beloved of God in the Torah. Most of us are going to be doing the work of trying to get there for our entire lives. But if you get there, this image to me is so captivating. You're moving through the world, all of the trappings, all of that language of you better do this and you better do that, it all falls away. You're generous, you're thoughtful, you're awake, you're intelligent, you're observing things. All of that is happening of its own accord, having done all of this work of the practice of the mitzvot to get you to that point. And he also thinks that this is when he uses love, just to understand that loving God, he thinks, is a continuous activity that links up with knowledge of God. And that's, we can just look at it briefly. It's the middle of paragraph 6 on the left-hand side. In the middle of that paragraph, this is the last paragraph of the Book of Knowledge. One only loves God with the knowledge with which one knows God. According to the knowledge will be the love. I'll just say that last line again. According to the knowledge will be the love. So to raise up the Maimonides kind of example, after, I think, Rabbi Feinstein, you gave the fullness of the Halevi position. The fullness of the Rambam position would be why what's available to us is a knowledge of God so sublime, so beyond the everyday, something that once it's achieved, it can never be taken away. It's a knowledge of God that just becomes who you are and how you move through the world. And yeah, you could say it's a state that, is it exclusively a Jewish option? I think what he would say is that the laws of Moshe and of the Torah are the most wonderful way to get there. It's like what we got was the best RX for knowledge of God on the planet. This is it. Follow this. And what you will gradually acquire over time is the capacity to know God in a way that is so complete and absolute. That's what it is to achieve eternal life. That's what it is to have bliss. And to limit your religious life to your immediate experience, what comes at you right in the moment, I think what he would say is that might be very powerful, but just understand that's quite ephemeral, changing, not lasting. So you have it for when you have it, and then you don't when you don't. So he's after something transcendent. So I throw that, I put that out there as a presentation of the other model of what might compel the teenager or the adult in embracing a religious life.
So the analogy that works for me when I try to figure out what he's talking about, Walter Isaacson, who's a wonderful journalist, wrote a beautiful biography of Albert Einstein. And he talked about Einstein when he figured out relativity. And it came to him, of all places, on a streetcar in Zurich. He was working as a patent clerk. Guy had a PhD from the Zurich Polytechnic Institute, but he couldn't get a job at a university anyplace. So he's working as a patent clerk in Zurich. And he's sitting on a streetcar. And he's sitting on a streetcar and he's watching he's going down the street, and another streetcar is coming toward him, right? And suddenly he has the following sort of intellectual exercise, which is, suppose my streetcar was going the speed of light, and that streetcar was going the speed of light. Would that streetcar look to me like it was going double the speed of light? And he said that would be impossible. And it was that moment that Einstein figured out what relativity physics would look like. And he spent the rest of his life working out the mathematics of it. But Isaacson talks about these moments of ecstasy. It's a kind of intellectual ecstasy. It's not the lover's ecstasy or the artistic ecstasy. Those are different kinds of. But there's an intellectual when you finally get it. And that, I think that's what the Rambam gets it. His universe, all the pieces of the universe fit together, and it all makes sense. I think that's the moment he's trying to point to, which is very different than we have at least at this moment in our history, we have a much more sort of emotional religious life. We like to go to shul and sing and clap and bang our feet and we have this sort of emotional. His life, it's not emotional in that kind of sense. It's the emotion you get from really hard intellectual work, and then suddenly it becomes clear to you, right? It becomes clear to you. You want to add something, John?
So I think that idea, in a way, is if we were to apply that to, say, Moses, it seems like Moses' experience with God.
Yeah. Right. Well, because for Rambam, I don't want to interrupt you, but I'll interrupt you. You were right. Rambam looked upon Moses as the paragon, as the ideal, right? First of all, it was his namesake. His name was Moses ben Maimon, so Moses was somebody he was interested in. And for Maimonides, Moses was the ideal. He was the most realized human being who ever lived. And Moses' experience of climbing the mountain to get the commandments from God, the Torah from God, is Maimonides' metaphor for this process. How do I go from a life of sensuousness, of emotion, of business, of material satisfaction, desires, up the mountain until I get to the top where everything in my life is devoted to knowing God, to the apprehension of God, right? It's the equivalent of Plato's journey, the cave. So that's Maimonides' idea, that you go up the mountain, you follow Moses up the mountain, right? So you have it exactly right. But you see, he doesn't see, for Maimonides, it's not the same. For Maimonides, Moses' journey is not that. It's the journey of the mind, right? To know God. And Moses is the guy who knows God face to face, says the Torah, right? Okay? Did I get that right?
Yes, but the difficulty is, to your point, that for the Rambam will raise up Moses as the ultimate prophet by virtue of the apprehension of God that he achieved through his intellect. The Rambam describes Moses as having a capacity of perception like a clear mirror or perfect glass. He had so conditioned himself, and his capacity for apprehension was so fine-tuned, he could apprehend God most directly. That accounts for his prophecy. So for the Rambam, prophet and philosopher that's the same person. One of Halevi's points in the Kuzari, right off the bat, the way he dismisses the philosophers, he says, we all know that a lot of the prophets who have come down in history have not been of a philosophical type. Let's be real here. And Moses would be a great example. Moses is not described as an intellectual in the Torah. So the way that the Rambam presents Moshe as the, Lo kam b'Yisrael ke Moshe. Oh, there's no one of Israel who has ever been like Moses who could have that perfect prophecy. But for the Rambam, that must be the truth about Moses' prophecy, though it's not how it's rendered in the Torah. So in the Torah, you're going to have stories about Moshe and the person of Moshe that, and this is where, and one of my excerpts bring this up, that you're going to have accounts of Moshe and even of God that do not correspond to what is ultimately true about God or about prophecy. The Rambam felt that the Torah, being that it was a communication to the people, meant to effectively kind of assist them in the religious life. The Torah is not a philosophical manual, and it even has misleading descriptions of God, only because those descriptions are the most effective when you're speaking to the unenlightened masses. And that's the elitist refrain throughout the Maimonidean corpus. And that includes descriptions of Moshe. So on the face of it, I'm going to agree with you. Moshe has a personal life. He gets angry. He hits the rock. This is not the perfect philosopher, but the Rambam has to maintain that what prophecy is intellection. And Moshe's prophecy is perfect because it was as perfect as you could come to knowing God directly, which is actually why he was able to deliver to the people such an effective system of divine laws that will both help the individual and the society towards, in their movement towards knowing God. So just as the Torah describes God creating the world, redeeming the people from Egypt, responding to their cries, all of these aspects that are highly anthropomorphic, human-like descriptions of God that fill the Torah. For Halevi, he would say, of course, just as Rabbi Feinstein was saying, we met God, God responded to us, and the Torah tells all of that history, and we've preserved it. The Rambam actually has to do a lot of creative interpreting of the biblical text because it seems to describe a divine figure so enmeshed in personal dynamics with humanity.
So I want to ask you a question because we're almost about out of time, and I don't want to leave without getting this in front of the group. So we've talked about these typologies, these types. Rambam and Halevi as types. Yes. Rambam is the rationalist, the philosopher, the Greek-thinking Jew, and Halevi as the romantic, the historical, experiential Jew. Okay, bring them to our day. Bring them now. Okay, as you walk the streets of Berkeley or I walk the streets of Encino, what does a Halevi Jew look like, and what does a Rambam Jew look like? Okay, and how do these two types, where do they find their place in our lives?
Well, first I'm going to say I don't think I'm more qualified than anybody here or anybody listening to think this question through, which is why in my notes, the last thing on my notes I have here is, right now at this moment, I will literally read this. Do we need a Halevi or a Maimonides right now? I wrote this down. Do we value a presentation of Judaism that lodges it right in the experience of the Jewish people? Or do we need a presentation of Judaism that establishes how it relates beautifully to what are understood today to be compelling values of social organization, of political life? Is that integrative move key? Or a kind of movement inward, resisting that integration and instead raising up what is distinctive and untranslatable? You can't translate it. You can't come in and out of it. It's kind of like one of the answers to the teenager is you could say, well, like it or not, it's your history. Whereas the Rambam is actually saying if you don't tend to the religious life, then, hopefully you'll behave well and won't be a menace to others, but you will not actually have achieved something beyond your just totally determined and accidental human life. So,
If you want balance, you need both.
Yeah.
You need both. And like a pendulum, it swings from one to the other, but you need both to have balance.
Can you live with both?
Right.
Yeah, you can learn to live with both. There are times when one is important, there are times when the other is important.
Yeah.
But most of the time, you're swinging between them. You need them. You need both to have balance.
So you think that Jews today, or Jews need to have a Maimonides side of your character and a Halevi side of your character? Okay, when does one come to the fore and when does the other?
It depends upon the situation.
Well, on what situations? In what situation would you want the Maimonides to show up, and in what situation?
By itself, I got news for you.
It comes by itself.
There are times when you
This is my father.
I know.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
when you look at something,
He's a great rabbi.
I,
you analyze it.
He's just dressed as a baker.
I mean, I also think a little bit as an educator, though I don't formally teach in a Jewish school or in an after school, but when I think about kids who are lucky enough to be getting a Jewish education, either at a day school or at a supplementary capacity, what a gift it would be. I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too. To introduce them to both, to the poetry of Halevi, to say, as a Jew, you belong, but you don't quite belong. You're part of a community with a history and a language. Let me teach you some Hebrew. Let's work with it. Let's write some poetry. It doesn't translate. Even if you're just doing calligraphy with these kids, you're bringing them close to a set of letters to say it's not going to be about translating these letters or these words into a language you understand. It's going to be about you coming closer to almost like the flame, the burning flames of these letters. That's what we're going to bring you towards. And we're not going to explain it all. But you have to also provide, I would say, an appreciation, something that allows a student to appreciate Judaism and their Jewish practice using the critical thinking that they're cultivating in every other realm, in every other context of their education and of their lives. You want to awaken their critical thinking, their intelligence, to say, what are the benefits of these mitzvot? What do you think a community looks like when they embrace those norms and they take them upon themselves as binding? What does a community look like when they don't take it upon themselves? And to think critically about law and halakha and how it shapes a person and a society. And to ask questions about God and what happens if you define God as almost like a personal force in the life of the Jewish people. Does that then generate other difficulties in how you think about Judaism? So I think exposing young people to both possibilities is very important, but I don't totally want to avoid your difficult question. I guess what I would say, I'll just jump to an answer, and I really didn't think about answering the question, but I would say we need Rambam very much.
Yeah.
In the sense that a careful, critical, thoughtful presentation of the place of religion in society for the individual, for the group, almost like the therapeutics of religion and why it can be so important and so salutary. I think that argument needs to be made, and I sometimes get concerned that if we only call upon the affective experience in religion, how good it feels, and come join us, and like I said, there's something ephemeral about that. The experience persists as long as the experience is happening, and then it's over.
I would go one more step, though. I think there's one more step to what you said, which was really beautifully said, which is I think that you need to teach the kid on both ends of those experiences, at both parts of the experience, to be unembarrassed, right? So I would want a kid, on the one hand, to be unembarrassed, to be chauvinistically Jewish, and to cherish the internal Jewish story and the internal Jewish sensibility, and not to feel embarrassed that that's who I am and that's what I am, and let the world come and understand me. And on the other side, I would not want the kid to be embarrassed when he or she asks the critical Maimonides question about what exactly do we stand for, and how do we know this is true, and what is its effect on character, and what kind of people does it make us? And what bothers me in our own Jewish world, and it's 9 o'clock, so I'm off duty now, is the way in which we criticize, we make each other embarrassed to be on either side of this. The universalists among us make the Halevi Jews embarrassed to say, but this is our experience, this is how I feel. And the Halevi Jews, the internalists, the particularists, make the Maimonideans feel embarrassed when they ask these deep and powerful critical questions about what exactly do we believe in? Why do we believe in these things? And what kind of people does it make us to believe in it? So I would like a kid to be able to play both games and be very unembarrassed and enjoy it. Be proud of both sides. I want to thank Deena for coming all the way down from Berkeley to be with us. It was a wonderful conversation, right? I want to thank Evelyn and Mesh for being such wonderful hosts. Thank you so much. Once again, this Shabbos we have Johnny Slater coming. He's just a spectacular teacher of Hasidism. Next week is Mitzvah Week. Steve Lopez will be here Wednesday night. And 2 weeks from tonight, we continue our conversation with Dean Josh Hollow from HUC to talk about mysticism and Kabbalah and what its role is in the Jewish world. So please come and join us. Have a wonderful, warm Shabbos. Stay warm, bundle up, snuggle with somebody warm.
It'll be a lot colder out here in New York.